All right, time for another pro tip. This one's about using calculated fields with counts. And if you recall in the intro lecture about calculated fields, I mentioned that any metric that's included in a calculated field calculation will be evaluated as a sum by default. But there's actually a way around that. I'm going to show you how it works. So first things first, let's adjust our pivot here. Instead of data by country, let's pull in data by rating and only filter down to G, PG, PG-13, and R. And there you go. We can pull out profit, and we can pull out ROI. Those were the calculated fields that we had created. Keep in mind that they are still here available for us if we choose to use them later. They don't disappear. And we're going to look at gross revenue. So looking at this view here, we still have the 5-year time frame selected, and we're looking at total revenues broken down by ratings. So looking at this view, you may be tempted to say that PG-13 movies perform better than any other rating. And that's true if you're defining performance in terms of the total volume of gross revenue. But as an analyst, I would argue that it's not really an apples-to-apples comparison, and a more meaningful measure of performance might be the gross revenue per title or per film, because we know that fewer films are released that are rated G or PG compared to PG-13 and R. And in fact, we can see that simply by pulling title into our pivot and comparing the number of titles. Another way to do that quickly was just to change the summarization mode from sum to count, and that essentially says that there are 10 instances or 10 data points of gross revenue that fall into the G bucket. And since our data is at the title level, that means that there are 10 titles assigned to that rating. And then moving our way down, we can see there are 104 PG titles, 305 PG-13, and 320 R titles. So when you look at it simply as a count of titles, it becomes clear that it's really not an even playing field and that it doesn't make sense to compare the performance of PG-13 or R ratings as a whole against G or PG. So if we pull in another instance of gross revenue, one thing that we can do in this case is simply change the summarization to an average and format it as currency. And what this will do is it will give us the number that we're looking for. So this tells us the total revenue divided by the number of titles. Since, again, our data is at the title level, we don't care about weighting the revenue differently for any certain titles. In this case, it's as simple as that. We can now see that G movies, even though they drove the lowest volume of revenue, actually had the highest revenue per title of almost 110 million. Now that approach works fine in this case because it's a relatively simple case, but what if you wanted to approach the same question using a calculated field? If I go into Pivot Table Tools, Fields, Items, and Sets, Calculated Field, and create a new field called Revenue per Title, how could I go about creating a formula to capture this? The first approach might be gross revenue divided by title, but the problem with this is that title is a text field. It's a dimension, not a metric. So dividing by a text field doesn't really make any sense. And if I try to do that, Excel will give me this div0 error. So let's go back in to our calculated field. We'll drill down to that revenue per title metric. And really what we want here isn't gross revenue divided by title, it's gross revenue divided by the count of titles. Now in theory this sounds right, and on paper it's exactly what I want, but when I press OK, it's returning values, but they're not the correct values. It's actually just returning the sum of revenue. It's not dividing them by the count of titles, which should return these values here in column D. And the problem lies in the fact that any metric included in one of these calculated field formulas will always evaluate using a sum, no matter what. Even if I'm showing gross revenue in my pivot table view as an average, as a min, as a max, as a count, it doesn't matter. As part of a calculated field and in the context of this dialog box, it will always evaluate to a sum. So even though I tried to force it to take a count, that's just not doable in this scenario. But there's good news. We do have a way to get around this, and the approach we take will actually give us some tools that we can use to answer some much more sophisticated, complicated questions moving forward, which we'll practice in the last section of this course when we dig into some case studies. So I'm going to go ahead and close this box. And here's the approach. I'm going to actually go into my raw data itself and add a new column. And I'm going to name this column number of titles. And I'm naming it number of titles because I know my data is at the title level. If my data was at the review level, I would label this column number of reviews. If my data was at the date level, I would call it number of days. In this case, title level, I'm creating a new column called number of titles, and this column will only take a value of 1 in every single row. So I'll double click to apply it down. I'm going to fill that without formatting. And now the only value in that entire column is 1. So if we jump back to our pivot, go into our tools and refresh, now we'll see this new field we just created called number of titles. And this is the field that we can now use in our calculated field. So if we go back in, we open up our last version of revenue per title. Now step back and think about this for a second. The second half of this equation, we're trying to return the count of title, or in other words, the number of rows in the actual data set. Now the count of the title is equal to the sum of that new metric that I just created called number of titles. And because calculated fields can only evaluate metrics as a sum, just dropping in this number of titles field that I just created will do the trick. So now I'm looking at the sum of gross revenue divided by the sum of number of titles. And when we press OK, there you go. Let's format as currency. Boom, we get the exact values that we had, taking our average approach. Now, again, obviously, the summarization approach that we took in column D in this particular case is the easier answer, but I wanted to take this opportunity to introduce this concept of using a count column as a means of enabling some of the more complicated calculated field problems that we're going to address later in the course.